Chapter 1. The observation begins. Drac watched the humans from the observation deck, squinting at the strange behavior unfolding on his screen. Across the city, human inhabitants bustled with life, laughter, and the incessant urge to speak. To each other, to animals, and even, astonishingly, to machines. In the quiet of his sterile laboratory, Drac's brow creased in confusion. He leaned closer to the screen, muttering, "Why do they speak to things that cannot answer?" The lab's sensors hummed in response, and Hera, his rival, chuckled softly from across the room. She leaned against her terminal with an air of smug superiority. "They are hopelessly sentimental creatures, Drac. They assign personalities to lifeless objects. That's what makes them so exploitable." Her dark eyes narrowed. "Mark my words, this so-called empathy will be their undoing." Drac's eyes flicked back to the screen. A human woman crouched down to address her pet. A small, furry creature with wide eyes and an animated tail that thumped against the ground in response to her cooing voice. A man walked by, offering her a friendly nod, then continued down the street, whistling cheerfully as he patted the back of a robotic cleaner, as though it might be listening. Drac felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Curiosity? No, something subtler. Perhaps, Drac replied cautiously, but this empathy, as you call it, has kept them alive on a chaotic, unpredictable planet. Their habit of connecting with creatures and objects alike has created bonds that we do not yet fully understand. He tried to sound indifferent, though part of him knew his interest was piquing more than he intended. Hera's laugh was short and dismissive. "Bonds," she scoffed. "What good is a bond with a non-sentient object? They've grown soft, attached to things they can neither control nor communicate with. To them, a toaster is a friend, and a cleaning machine is a companion. It's absurd." She glanced back at her own monitor, where tactical diagrams of possible strategic infiltrations flashed. Her expression turned critical. "I say we exploit this weakness, target what they hold dear, break these childish bonds, and they'll crumble." Drac said nothing. Instead, he watched the screen a little longer, eyes tracing the path of a child who was now cradling a stuffed animal, chattering to it softly. He observed the man who'd named the robotic cleaner, saw him straighten its path when it veered off course. These small acts fascinated him. He understood the strategic edge Hera saw. Exploit the human's connection to trivial things, and they might indeed falter. But something made him pause. Drac cleared his throat. "Hera, I think it would be short-sighted to dismiss this trait without understanding it fully. There is something more here than simple sentimentality." Hera snorted, folding her arms. "Simple sentimentality is exactly what makes them weak. They'd be better off without such distractions." Drac turned to face her, voice steady. "Perhaps, but imagine if their strength lies in these distractions. What if their odd connections allow them to cooperate, to unify? What if these distractions are the foundation of their resilience?" Her brows lifted, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before it hardened again. "If you're so interested in their quirks, why don't you conduct your own experiment?" she challenged. "Find out if there's anything more to this foolish attachment than meets the eye. But I'll tell you now, Drac, it's a waste of time." As she left the lab, her confidence hung in the air, and Drac felt the weight of her words. But he couldn't shake his curiosity. He turned back to his console and typed in a few commands, setting up a controlled test. It would be a simple experiment. He would place a small machine, a lifeless, nondescript device, within the human settlement. Something that might seem like it had been lost, but held no true function. He wanted to see if the humans would notice if they project their empathy onto it, and if that empathy would drive them to action. The device, a small, spherical droid, was programmed to emit a low hum, something that could easily be mistaken for distress. He set it down in the middle of a park under the cover of night, adjusting his monitor to capture the scene. Then he waited. At dawn, the humans began to trickle into the park. A group of children spotted the droid first, one child gasping and pointing as if she'd found a rare treasure. They clustered around it, eyes wide, and Drac's ears perked up as he watched them stroke its surface, murmuring in soft tones as though it were a fragile, living creature. The sphere chirped, and the children giggled, embracing it as though it were a lost pet in need of care. Drac leaned forward, captivated. The children debated among themselves, one suggesting they take it to an adult for help. Before long, the children carried the device to a man seated on a nearby bench. He chuckled, examining the droid with mild amusement, then gently instructed the children to take good care of their new friend until they found its owner. Friend. The word echoed in Drac's mind, and a strange thought crept in, one he was almost reluctant to admit. These humans, with all their strange attachments, their insistence on anthropomorphizing the unfeeling, the lifeless, they were doing something remarkable. They were showing compassion, even to something that could never repay it. Perhaps, Drac mused, they knew something his own people had forgotten. Watching them cradle the droid like a helpless creature, he felt an inkling of doubt about the simplicity of Hera's theory. Perhaps this empathy was more than just a weakness to be exploited. As the day wore on, and more humans approached the droid with gentle curiosity, Drac leaned back, a new understanding beginning to settle in. The humans were not simply sentimental. They were something more, and he had only just begun to understand them. This chapter establishes Drac's initial skepticism, Hera's ambition, and the intrigue surrounding humanity's seemingly frivolous empathy. It sets the stage for Drac's slow, reluctant shift in perspective as he begins to understand the depth of human resilience, rooted in their capacity for empathy and connection. Chapter 2. The Experiment. Drac sat at his console, rewatching the footage of the children carrying the spherical droid through the park as if it were a precious creature in need of rescue. His initial astonishment had transformed into something deeper, a fascination tinged with a growing, uneasy respect. He hadn't expected such an earnest response. The human's behavior seemed almost ritualistic, as if empathy itself had become a kind of instinct. Drac, what is this? More recordings? Hera's voice snapped him back to the present. She strode into the lab, glancing skeptically at the screen. Still obsessed with your experiment? Drac minimized the screen, hiding his unease. Simply collecting data. I wanted to observe their interactions in a natural setting. Hera smirked, unimpressed. And what have you learned from their sentimental nonsense? Surely they didn't react as if that thing was alive. Drac hesitated, debating how much to share. He was reluctant to reveal the depths of his own intrigue, aware of how Hera would dismiss it. They took to the device almost immediately. The children named it and even decided to bring it to an adult for safekeeping. Of course they did. Hera rolled her eyes. That's exactly what I mean, Drac. Their willingness to adopt even a lifeless object only shows how easily they can be manipulated. Such pathetic emotional attachment. Drac bit back a retort, watching Hera with a carefully neutral expression. Perhaps, but we shouldn't ignore how this attachment functions in their society. Their empathy might serve a purpose beyond what we understand. Oh, please, she said, dismissing him with a wave. They'd be better off without such irrational habits. Efficiency, structure. Those are the qualities that define strength. As Hera spoke, Drac replayed a few seconds of the footage in his mind. The way the children had tenderly cradled the device, how they'd bonded over their shared concern for it. There was a harmony there, a kind of unified purpose that felt powerful. I'll conduct a follow-up test, Drac said finally. The results will speak for themselves. Hera arched an eyebrow, her curiosity momentarily piqued. A follow-up? And how do you plan to test their empathy this time? Drac chose his words carefully. I'll program the device to emit a faint signal, a distress beacon, perhaps. I want to see how far they'll go to help something they believe is in need. Hera snorted. Fine. Waste your time if you must. But I guarantee this will prove my point. With a curt nod, she left the lab, and Drac turned back to his console, an idea already forming in his mind. He modified the device's programming, giving it the capability to emit a weak, intermittent distress signal. The signal was simple, a soft, pulsing beep accompanied by a flicker of light. It would register to humans as a distress call, but subtle enough not to alarm them immediately. He placed the device in a new location, an alley near the outskirts of the settlement, where it might be mistaken for lost equipment, waiting to be rescued. The following day, Drac monitored the live feed with a focused intensity. Hours passed before a pair of humans, a young woman and an older man, wandered into the alley. They paused, noticing the faint beeping, and exchanged glances. "Do you hear that?" the woman asked, cocking her head to listen. The man nodded. "It sounds strange, almost like it's calling for help." Drac's pulse quickened as the two approached the device. The woman knelt beside it, examining the small, glowing sphere with a curious, almost maternal expression. She picked it up, holding it carefully as though it were something fragile. "Poor thing," she murmured, brushing her fingers across its surface. "It's probably some kid's toy. They must be worried about it. Or maybe it's something important," the man replied. "We should find out who it belongs to. It's clearly broken or lost." Without hesitation, they carried the device out of the alley and back toward the main part of the settlement. Drac watched, his fascination growing as the pair began asking others if they'd lost something small and round that beeps. People stopped to look, curiosity spreading like wildfire. Some even offered to help, scanning their devices and contacting nearby residents to see if anyone could identify the object. Drac leaned back, processing the scene with mounting astonishment. The humans' response had shifted from individual curiosity to a communal effort. What began as a single, empathetic gesture was becoming a collective mission. Within the hour, a small group had gathered, each person sharing theories about the device and speculating on what kind of help it needed. One woman suggested bringing it to the nearest repair station, while another offered to post a notice in case its owner was searching for it. Drac observed with a sense of awe he could no longer ignore. These humans were not merely sentimental. They operated within a network of trust and shared responsibility that seemed to strengthen their bonds. Even over something as insignificant as a small, beeping sphere, they displayed a resilience and unity he hadn't anticipated. He was so engrossed in the unfolding scene that he almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching. Hera was back, peering over his shoulder with an expression of smug satisfaction. "So," she drawled, "what have you learned from this bonding ritual?" Drac hesitated. A part of him wanted to shield these findings from Hera's cynicism, but he forced himself to stay objective. They've rallied around the device as if it were one of their own. Their collective empathy seems to drive them toward unity, even for something that doesn't serve them directly. Unity? Over a toy? Hera scoffed. "I'd call it naivety, not unity. They're wasting time, effort, and resources. That's not strength. That's a liability." Drac met her gaze, struggling to contain his frustration. And yet, if their empathy strengthens their resolve, if it binds them together, perhaps it's not as useless as we thought. Hera rolled her eyes. "Keep dreaming, Drac. That sentimentality will be their downfall. Mark my words." As she left, Drac turned back to the screen, an uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Hera was right about one thing. The humans' empathy could be a vulnerability, but it could also be their greatest strength, a driving force behind their resilience and their fierce, inexplicable loyalty. As the humans carried the device away, Drac felt an odd pang in his chest, a sensation he didn't have a name for. He only knew one thing for certain. This experiment had unearthed something he hadn't expected, and it left him wondering just how much more he had yet to understand. In this chapter, the tension builds as Drac's experiment escalates, revealing the humans' collective empathy and their willingness to help even when there is no immediate benefit. Drac's observations contrast sharply with Hera's cynicism, setting the stage for his growing admiration for humanity's strength hidden within their weakness. Chapter 3. The Warning. Drac was restless, pacing the length of his lab as his thoughts churned. It had been 3 days since he'd last observed the humans' reaction to his distress signal test, and the results were both unsettling and intriguing. The humans had not only unified to find the device's owner, but they'd also repaired it, adding small modifications to improve its mobility and power efficiency. Their willingness to help, even an inanimate object, was not only resourceful, but inexplicably powerful. A soft chime broke through his thoughts, signaling an incoming communication. He glanced at the monitor. It was Tyron, the commander of his research vessel. Drac, Tyron's gruff voice came through the console, calm yet urgent. We need to talk. I just received an update on your assignment. Drac straightened, his mind racing. He knew Tyron didn't interfere lightly, and he braced himself for what was coming. Yes, Commander. Is there something specific you're concerned about? There's been a shift in priorities, Tyron replied, his face impassive. Our superiors have decided that the human's empathy isn't just a harmless trait. They now consider it a potential threat, a vulnerability we could exploit. Drac's stomach twisted. Exploit, he echoed, unable to keep the dismay out of his voice. Yes, they believe that if pressed, this tendency to form attachments could be used against them. Break their spirit, fracture their unity. Tyron's eyes narrowed, scanning Drac's reaction. You've been on the ground longer than any of us. Do you agree? Drac hesitated, feeling an odd, uncharacteristic protectiveness toward the humans he'd studied. Commander, the humans' empathy may seem irrational, but it's a critical part of their resilience. I don't think it would be as easy to weaponize as they assume. Tyron's gaze hardened. It isn't your job to think, Drac. It's your job to report and analyze. And the analysis is clear. Find a way to exploit this trait or hand over the project to someone who will. Drac felt a surge of indignation, carefully masked as he nodded. Understood, Commander, he said evenly, ending the transmission. Alone once more, Drac gripped the edges of his console, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he followed orders, he'd be betraying the very principles he'd come to respect. But if he disobeyed, he risked not only his career, but his own safety. He opened the footage from the human's last interaction with the device, studying it with a fresh intensity. The faces of the children, the adults who'd volunteered their time to help. It wasn't weakness he saw. It was strength, bound by a powerful and mysterious force he hadn't fully understood until now. The door slid open behind him, and Hera entered, her eyes sharp as they landed on his monitor. You look troubled, Drac. You're not letting this empathy nonsense cloud your judgment, are you? Drac forced a neutral expression, closing the video. No, of course not. I'm merely evaluating the best approach to proceed. She smirked, sensing his hesitation. Proceed? Or are you hesitating because you think they're what? Worth protecting? Her voice dripped with mockery, but her gaze was probing. Drac straightened, maintaining his composure. It's a complex species, Hera. Their empathy has a purpose beyond what we initially thought. I don't think our commanders fully appreciate that. She crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. And here I thought you were smarter than that. They're sentimental creatures driven by weakness. Use it against them before they use it against us. Her words were cold, dismissive, and absolute. Drac exhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. I understand your perspective, Hera, but what if that sentimentality makes them stronger? What if it's precisely this connection that's made them resilient enough to survive? She scoffed, but Drac caught a glint of irritation in her eyes. That's the sort of thinking that'll get you reassigned. Or worse. She paused, giving him a meaningful look. We're here to assess threats, Drac, not admire them. With a final, disdainful glance, she turned and left the lab. As the door slid shut behind her, Drac felt the room close in around him. He was running out of time and options. The idea of abandoning the humans felt wrong, but he knew he couldn't openly defy his orders. That night, he devised a new plan. The following day, he set out toward the settlement, his small cloaked ship landing silently near the edge of town. His pulse quickened as he approached the humans, concealed behind an electromagnetic shield that masked his presence. His modified device was ready, one that would emit a stronger signal, something the humans would instinctively want to help. He placed it in a dilapidated building, the signal thrumming softly. Within minutes, he saw humans gathering, their expressions troubled as they moved toward the sound. Is it coming from there? One of them murmured, peering at the entrance. Let's check it out, another said, already moving forward with determination. Drac watched as they approached his device, sharing concerned glances as they debated what to do. Just as one of them reached out to lift it, He pressed a button on his console, amplifying the signal. A high-pitched alarm blared, loud enough to send them stumbling back in alarm. "Wait! What's happening?" one of them cried, looking around in confusion. It's almost like it's scared," another whispered, eyes wide. Drax's chest tightened, an unexpected pang of guilt prickling him. He watched as they regrouped, their expressions shifting from fear to resolve. They didn't flee. They didn't abandon each other. Instead, they gathered closer, forming a protective circle around the device, voices murmuring encouragement as if to reassure it. In that moment, Drax realized something profound. These humans, despite their fear, would go to extraordinary lengths to protect even a perceived life, no matter how absurd it seemed. Their empathy wasn't a weakness at all. It was a strength, a force that bound them together in defiance of fear. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Hera had followed him, watching from the shadows, her gaze icy and unyielding. She raised a communication device to her mouth, her eyes never leaving his face. "Drax, you're either with us, or you're with them," she said, her tone dangerously soft. "Make your choice." Drax met her gaze, the weight of his decision heavy but clear. He turned back to the humans, who were still huddled around the device, whispering soft reassurances to it as though it were alive. With a deep breath, he straightened, feeling the last remnants of doubt dissolve. "I choose them," he whispered, knowing full well the consequences awaiting him. Chapter 4. The choice. Drax kept his eyes on the humans as they worked, surrounding the device in a tight circle. Their murmurs of concern carried on the air, words of encouragement spoken to something they could only imagine was sentient. The device's hum filled the room, amplifying in pitch to simulate distress. It was a sound he'd chosen deliberately, intending to test their reaction to a helpless entity in apparent agony. But something had changed. A familiar voice crackled in his earpiece. "Drax." Hera's voice was clipped, her usual detachment replaced by simmering irritation. "What's your status?" "You were supposed to signal the command team when the humans reached the device. We're prepared to initiate extraction." Drax's hand hovered over the console, fingers itching to disable the signal. "Hera, I need more time," he said, his voice firm but laced with tension. "There's something here we haven't considered, a resilience in them that I think goes beyond empathy." Hera's scoff came through the line, cold and dismissive. "Resilience? What are you saying, Drax? Don't tell me you've gone soft." He hesitated. "No, I'm telling you that if we move forward with the extraction plan, we'll be eliminating a species that could become an asset, not a threat. They're adaptable, intuitive, perhaps even more so than we realized. And their connections to each other aren't weaknesses. They're strengths." She was silent for a moment, and he could almost see her narrowing gaze. "If you're questioning the mission's validity, Drax, then maybe you're not fit to be here." "Maybe you're right," he replied, his voice steady as he finally disconnected, disabling her line. A deep sense of resolve settled over him as he stepped into the room with the humans, his cloaking field dissipating. The humans froze, eyes widening as they took in his form. Tall, gray-skinned, eyes dark and calculating. For a heartbeat, the room was silent, their expressions oscillating between fear and fascination. One of them, a young woman with steady eyes, took a hesitant step forward. Are you the one behind this?" she asked, voice wavering but steady. "Yes," Drax replied, meeting her gaze. "I am responsible for this device, for the tests. I needed to understand how you would react to something that appeared in distress." His voice softened as he added, "I underestimated you." A murmur rippled through the group, and the young woman's expression shifted from fear to something else, a mix of anger and understanding. "You mean you were testing us? For what?" "To see if your empathy would betray you. If your desire to help, even in dangerous situations, was a vulnerability we could exploit." The word sounded hollow even to him, the plan now feeling futile in the face of their determined stares. An older man in the group stepped forward, folding his arms. "And did you get what you wanted?" he asked, voice steady, eyes unyielding. Drax shook his head slowly. "No," he admitted. "What I found was unexpected. I saw you all come together, even for something that might have been a trap. You didn't hesitate to protect, even when you could have walked away." The young woman's eyes softened, and she took another step forward. "Then you know who we are. We're stronger because we stand together. And if you're here to tear that apart, you won't succeed." A pang of something close to admiration struck Drac. "Your unity has more strength than my species could have imagined," he admitted, his voice laced with a respect that felt foreign and yet fitting. Hera's voice cut through the air, her form materializing in the doorway. She was fuming, her gaze fierce as she glared at Drac. "Enough of this, Drac. Stand down. We're taking these creatures in for further analysis." The humans recoiled, their faces flickering with fear as they saw another alien appear. But Drac held his ground. "They are not creatures," he said firmly, his voice louder, defiant. "They are a people, stronger and more connected than we knew. I won't allow this mission to harm them." Hera's eyes narrowed, her hand hovering over a control device on her wrist. "You're risking everything, Drac. Do you understand that? You're choosing them over your own kind." Drac met her gaze, unflinching. "Yes," he said, the single word of declaration. "If protecting their unity, their resilience, means that I betray our orders, then so be it." Hera's eyes blazed, but Drac saw a flicker of disbelief, a fracture in her confidence. "Very well," she hissed, "but don't expect mercy when you return." Turning to the humans, Drac took a step back, lowering his head slightly in a gesture of respect. "Go," he told them. "Return to your lives, and remember this. Your strength lies in each other. Protect that unity, for it's what makes you who you are." The young woman hesitated, her eyes full of questions. But she gave a single nod, her face set in resolve, and began to usher the others toward the exit. They moved in a unified group, glancing back only once before disappearing into the night. As the last human slipped from view, Hera fixed Drac with a look of cold fury. "You've made a terrible mistake." Drac met her gaze, unyielding. "I made a choice to protect what I believe in, something worth far more than orders." He felt a surprising lightness settle over him, a clarity that he had never known. With one last glance, Hera turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving Drac alone with a faint, satisfied smile.